Okay, last online lecture for this class meeting. This one will be shorter than the last one, I promise. In this final installment, we're just briefly going to go over behavioral theory, which was another one of the foundational theories upon which current treatments of mental illnesses are based. As your book mentioned, behavioral therapy started gaining prominence in the middle of the 20th century, but the movement that spurred that prominence began much earlier, in the beginning of the 20th century. The motivation for this approach was really based on the philosophy of science that was beginning to develop during this period, which prioritized objective, empirical examination, that which could be seen, over the subjective, which was Freud's domain. This was a marked departure from Freud's ideas, which essentially purported that external behavior was a result of internal processes. Instead, and based on the work of John Watson, what behaviorists believe was that learning, and therefore behavior, was a result of responses to external stimuli. And this conclusion was based on two primary theories, the theory of classical conditioning and the theory of operant conditioning. The theory of classical conditioning resulted from the work of Ivan Pavlov and John Watson. Overall, classical conditioning is considered to be a form of associative learning, and we call it that because the theory suggests that learning occurs by pairing or associating a stimuli with a response. So here's the breakdown, and we'll use Pavlov's example of a dog here. Before conditioning, the neutral stimuli, in this case a bell, provokes no specific response, what we would call a neutral response. In this case, the dog is happy, but the dog isn't necessarily happy as a result of the ringing bell. It's just a happy dog overall. On the other hand, the unconditioned stimuli, in this case the food, creates what we would call an unconditioned response, a response that naturally occurs as a result of the stimuli, in this case, excessive drooling. Now, what classical conditioning theory tells us is that if we repeatedly present the neutral stimulus, or the ringing bell, just before the unconditioned stimulus, or the food, then eventually, once the pairing has occurred, the conditioned stimuli alone will cause what is now called a conditioned response. So whereas before the ringing bell caused no particular response, after the pairing occurred, hearing a ringing bell causes the dog to salivate. John Watson then expanded on these ideas, applying the principles of classical conditioning to humans with his little Albert experiment. Essentially, what he was trying to do in these experiments was to figure out if you could teach people to fear certain objects using the principles of classical conditioning. In the little Albert experiment, Watson first introduced a white rat to a baby. As expected, the white rat, which was a neutral stimulus initially, produced no specific reaction in the baby, which we'll call the neutral response. He also knew that if he rang a really loud bell behind the baby's head, the baby would naturally cry. As such, the bell was the unconditioned stimulus, and the crying was the unconditioned response. By repeatedly presenting the white rat right before the ringing bell, over time the presence of the white rat alone would cause the baby to cry. So when this occurs, we would say that the previously neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, which then evokes a conditioned response. Incidentally, and as you'll learn in the next class, the same pairing mechanism is currently thought to be the initial step in the development of both phobias and obsessive-compulsive disorder, according to what's called the two-factor model. The other primary theory that served as the foundation for the behavioral movement is the theory of operant conditioning. In general, the theory of operant conditioning supposes that voluntary behavior is shaped by consequences. So we both learn new behaviors and also learn to perform behaviors more or less frequently based on the consequences that follow a behavior. In operant conditioning, there are two main forms of consequences, reinforcement and punishment, both of which can be used to increase or decrease behaviors. The distinctions between positive and negative reinforcement and punishment can be a little tricky. So in trying to make sense of this, there are two things to consider: whether the behavior increases or decreases, and whether something was taken away or added. By determining those two pieces of the puzzle, then you'll know whether the consequence is positive or negative, and whether it's a reinforcer or a punisher. So anytime a consequence is added, then we say it's positive. If a consequence is removed, we call it negative. If the adding or removal of the consequence results in the behavior increasing, we call it reinforcement. Whereas if the adding or removal of the consequence results in the behavior decreasing, we call it punishment. So, for example, let's say that Shirley and Mike met at a party and exchanged numbers at the end of the night. When Mike called the next day, Shirley excitedly answered, but soon thereafter, Mike started calling all the time, which Shirley didn't like. So, to change that behavior, she started ignoring his phone calls, and eventually he stopped calling. Thinking about how Shirley's consequences affect Mike's behavior, first we can think about whether Mike's behavior increased or decreased. In this scenario, Mike's calling behavior eventually decreased, so we know we're dealing with a form of punishment. Then we can consider whether a consequence was added or taken away in order to lead to that behavioral change. In this instance, we know that Shirley's behavior decreased, that is, she stopped picking up the phone, so we know we're in the negative category. Putting these two things together, we can conclude that Shirley's behavior served as a form of negative punishment for Mike's behavior. We'll talk through more examples of operant and classical conditioning in class, but overall, the take-home idea is that according to behavioral theory, mental illness is learned, either as a result of consequences or of pairing.